I'm going to go over the ARC, the different sections of the study guide on Pathwork Lecture 183, The Spiritual Meaning of Crisis. So I divided it up into 4 different sections as usual. First section was on defining crisis. The guide expresses that crisis is an attempt of nature to affect change. And in other areas, the lectures say that everything on this earth reflects a spiritual truth. The interpretation may not reflect that, but the actual event does reflect a spiritual truth. So that you can take the definition of crisis as stagnation and apply it to geology, to where 2 tectonic plates are supposed to slip on each other and move slowly over time, and they get stuck. And the forces build up and build up and build up until an abrupt break has to occur. And in the real world, when an abrupt break happens, it's an earthquake, and it can be a pretty big one. And mountains fall, cities crumble, people get hurt. But if you'll keep in mind the definition of crisis, meaning the attempt of nature to effect change, it is part of the organic growth of the planet for the tectonic plates to move. So that mountains are created, but they're created slowly, gradually, over time. Same thing is true when you get down to an individual example of crisis. Crisis means that something has to change and it's stuck. And at some point, change has to occur without cooperation, without grace, without our conscious permission, without being able to manage the after effects. So the corollary of that would be, if you don't want crisis to happen, it is important to look at factors and see where places are getting a little bit stuck, and lubricate, allow, accept, explore, examine, experiment with change, so that the change that is necessary won't become abrupt. Now, I could think of 20 different examples of this, 100 different examples, but sometimes it's easier to just think in terms of 1 or 2, like tectonic plates. There is another example that is present in my energy system and my presentations during this month and last, and that is, I'm going to use that as an example. My son died unexpectedly in May. I wondered if I should continue with the online meetings or cancel them. Now, why would I cancel them? Because a distraught parent is not a good therapist, and a needy person is not a good therapist, and a person who can't get their head together is not a good therapist. So there would be many practical reasons to give the clients a break while I took care of my emotional needs. However, Pathwork may not be an egalitarian community. We don't just sit around and chat together, but it is a community. And I am a member of the communities that I have created over time. And I feel supported by these communities, even though I am facilitating rather than usually participating. So I wanted to continue. So how to avoid crisis? How to avoid a conflict here? And so I tried to be open to what is right for me and what is right for the community. And what entered into my mind at that point is a feeling that I'd had off and on for months. And that was that I'm a very strong facilitator. And I run a somewhat authoritarian process group to create a safe container for the person who is revealing themselves. And that can lead to shutting down a little experimentation, creativity, unstructured sharing. And I wondered if people might like to use the groups with me holding as gatekeeper, but not process. So I always fall back to the concept, Pathwork 143 concept of unity and duality instead of all or nothing, in the group, out of the group. What if I could find a way to be in the group, but not take the lead the majority of the time? So what I did was I offered to the group an experiment. There is a process called inspiraling that is used in Pathwork and in other places. I actually learned the essence of it from someone who taught how Quakers operate in their communities. And the essence is to give everybody time to speak, but not go on and on and on, but just to speak and then hear everyone else, and then speak and hear everyone else. And what happens is that there is a group consciousness that can emerge if this process is gentle and honest and there is a positive intention going on. So it may not be as easy to create an inspiral in any random group, but it is possible to do that in Pathwork. So I offered to the participants of the June meetings that we would inspiral for an hour of the hour-and-a-half meetings. And then if somebody wanted to process, I'd be willing to do that, facilitate that for the last half hour. And so we did that. There are 3 different groups populated by 3 different groups of individuals. So each group is different in a modest way, and some are crossovers. And it was awkward. You mean you just want me to talk? Yeah, we just want you to talk. Just share a few sentences. And you're not going to help? No, I'm going to just hear you. And this also allowed me a place to share, hopefully with some, also with some sense of limits, not to misuse that ability, but a place to just share in turn. Okay. And throughout the month, people got used to it. And we found this happening where I keep making this movement with my hands like a whirlpool. So we found that after the first few, I did this and you did that and he did the other, that on the second or third round, we were sharing, well, you know, he said this and I relate to that, and she said that and I relate in this way, not commenting upon other people sharing, but building a deeper sense of universal experience, each person having a facet of a certain type of experiment, experience. So in one particular meeting, we started off and we wound up very quickly on the track of feeling that, turns out a lot of the people on that particular meeting felt like they were introverts. And one person shared about that experience, and then another person shared, and pretty soon we were all sharing about our experience of being an introvert in a world that tends to honor and appreciate extroverts. It was a very deep experience, unexpected. And while we don't come to conclusions in such explorations, there is a feeling of really hearing someone else's experience. And throughout the month, I vented some of my grief. I expressed some of the things that were on my mind. And I feel that I got through my process much more quickly by being a part of the group than by attempting to stand back and hold on to my feelings and help others with theirs. Now, I give that as a somewhat lengthy example of if crisis is an attempt of nature to effect change, then by not resisting the change, I managed not to go into crisis by either behaving badly as a therapist facilitator, but also by not isolating myself from the possibility of misbehaving or mismanaging. By bringing in what might help other people as well as myself, I was responding to a vague sense that we might want to shift the format a little bit, that there were other possibilities that hadn't been explored. So my so-called weakness in that moment allowed for other people to feel a different way of being together in community and in discussion. So that's an example of how crisis can be averted with a willingness to shift, change, explore, experiment. Now, as part of this month, I perhaps overused the diagram or diagrams I found online of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And they are represented as triangles with lines between. And there's 4 or 5 levels. And I found that I didn't want to explain these to people. I wanted to just let them subliminally see them and see if they could relate, how they wanted to relate to the text. That may have been a little bit too subtle. My intention was that if you're going to manage crisis, it is important to know at what level you're working on. There is a level of minimal needs for physiological safety that have nothing to do with feeling good. They have to do with staying alive. In a discussion the other day, we were talking about spiritual healing. And the dilemma with spiritual healing is the body may decide, with a massive facial injury, the body may decide all I have to have is the ability to eat and breathe. I don't need ears, I don't need eyes. The ego may, the mind may, but the body really works on a minimalist level very, very well. It just wants to survive. And then let the other elements of the personality and the body and et cetera take care of the finessing. So the body, for instance, when a body goes into shock, the conversation in the body goes something like this. We're going to die, so we need to allow the blood pressure to plummet. We need to, when the blood pressure plummets, blood to the extremities will be shut down almost completely. If there's any amputation, that'll take care of that. We're needing to shut down some of the brain functions too, because you see the body doesn't care about the mind, it cares about the brainstem. Remember that the body is concerned about survival at all costs. So the danger of going into shock is the body doesn't know how to finesse shock. It goes there with, pardon the pun, a hatchet, and just shuts down systems that don't seem necessary to preserve the core organ functions of the body. Now, we want more than to be a torso with a head attached. So as we go up Maslow's hierarchy, we have more, I'm going to call them fussy details. There's more detail in what we want to preserve and what we feel is being threatened. Our ideas of what death is change as we go up the hierarchy. So I've talked about the physiological level and how minimal it is. For just a moment, I want to talk about the tip of the triangle, which in Maslow is self-actualization, and in spiritual groups they add spiritual actualization rather than self, ego, human being actualization. In spiritual actualization, we may be just as blunt and minimalist and determined as the body. On a spiritual level, we may decide to sacrifice our human life for some cause. We may decide to sacrifice the needs of the ego or the needs of the emotional level of being because there's something more important in our understanding, in our perception. That doesn't mean that that's right, but it does mean that there is a pull sometimes towards a spiritual inclination towards something that may want to overwhelm the needs of the human being that brought it to that point of realization. A little complicated, but perhaps you can see that in a triangle where the bottom layer is I'm still breathing, and the top layer is I am where I need to be in space-time. There's a lot of latitude. So if you figure out where you're working on this Maslow's hierarchy, it can calm you down a little bit. Although it feels like this is a life and death issue, it's not actual physiological life and death. It's more about your ego's sense of succeeding versus not succeeding at a particular aspect of life. It's still important, but it's important also to put this into context. Now that's all about kind of defining what crisis is. Part 2 was about fear of change. Fear of change is about a decision that you may not be fully conscious of and you may not be able to control, to surrender to fear. So fear of change means that if you've got a deep unconscious fear of change, your outer faculties might not be able to control your fear. Fear is in charge and fear runs away, even though the rest of you are saying, no, 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 don't run. So if fear of change is on the surface, it may be very wrapped up in justification processes and rationalizations that basically say, I'm afraid and I don't want to give up being afraid. And so there's a place here where part of the crisis is you need to give up being so afraid that you can't even look at the details of what's going on. You can't even adjust what's going on. In effect, surrendering to fear means all or nothing. Whatever fear says we have to do, that's it. That's survival. Anything else is death. Notice that I keep going back to the idea of realistic thinking, where a decision is black and white, life or death. And we do that on purpose. There's a deliberateness here, where we do that in order to get over it. So there's a mechanism buried within us that says, I'm going to be so frightened that nobody can talk to me and nobody can talk me out of it, so I can get what I think is a solution and therefore avoid what I consider to be threatening. And yet, when we're in that, we don't realize that decision-making level. We just know that we are completely overwhelmed with fear. So fear of change contains somewhere in it a decision to surrender to fear. There's another aspect of that, which is abdicating the ability to make a decision. And the guide uses the phrase, I am so bad, I am nothing. And I'm doing this as a kid thing because that's what it is. It's an immature way of dodging the responsibility for making a decision. It's fear. If I make a decision, it won't be a great one. It won't be the right one. So I'll just throw up my hands in despair and say, I'm not worth making a decision. I have no authority. I'm not good enough. And again, inside that is a decision. And the decision is to let other people control your life. Other people can make the decisions for you. So that was part 2, fear of change. Part 3 involves defiance. Um, Defiance is not always easy to see because sometimes defiance looks like fear. And when defiance looks like fear, what it looks like is, I can't go on any longer. I'm out of patience. I'm out of ability. I'm helpless. I just can't go on any longer. I'm not going to talk about the grain of truth in that. There can be a grain of truth. What I'm speaking of is how we misuse the grain of truth. We misuse exhaustion. We misuse being so stressed we can't think straight. We use it as an excuse to avoid. This is different from being controlled by fear. This is more about, this is a tactic. If I can't function, I don't take responsibility. It can sound subtle, but there's a difference. There is defiance and fear, but it's so buried you can't get at it. There's a phrase in psychology that says, the first thing you have to do is stop the baby from crying, meaning that if somebody is screaming, you can't do therapy with that. You need to calm them down. Fear of change is like screaming or crying, and it's going to need to be calmed down before it can be analyzed. Defiance has a quality of cold, hard determination. This is not easy for some people to find in themselves, and there's a reason. That defiance is part of our resistance. I want to go back to the reason we're here. The reason we're here is there's something in the spirit world that we weren't able to work on. So we came here, we made that part bigger. I like to tease about this. There was a little tiny speck on the edge of our proverbial spiritual nose, but it was so small we couldn't deal with it. So we turned it into a giant wart on the tip of our nose, so that it was right in front of our vision, and we couldn't help but see it. And we go through life seeing this huge wart on the end of our nose until we deal with it. What resistance will say is, what wart on the end of my nose? Or, that's just the way it is, I'll just look around it. Or we'll try to remove it rather than process it without realizing the energy, the spiritual implications behind it. Now, I'm using that because I'm a kinesthetic and I feel things in my body. So my negativities, once I come to the moment of admitting them, feel like they've always been there, and I was successful at avoiding seeing them. And now I see them, and it's so obvious. But in hindsight, it's always obvious. So I cannot go any longer contains a seed of defiance. Now, this defiance can create a life-threatening situation. If the outer will, which is the topic of July, if the outer will is in defiance, and the inner will can't get through the outer will, then the guide's phrase is, if the outer will rejects change, the inner will may decide to find new life circumstances. In other words, if the outer will is blocking growth and transformation, which is the point of life, then the inner will may create new life circumstances. And an example of that is Eros takes off. Eros says, I got to get out of this situation. It's not healthy. It's not good. My Eros soars into space. I fall in love with someone. I become enamored with another profession. I become enamored of a spiritual group. Eros is a soul movement, and it's a message that something else is needed. in order for growth and transformation to proceed. The way I use this is fear of change is harder to manage because you've got to calm that down. And sometimes in the fear, people are reluctant to listen. It's easier to work with defiance. It really is. Defiance is more on the surface. And it is possible to demonstrate to people how they are deliberately not doing something. Especially since, as you can imagine, I work with people who are coming to learn about growth and transformation. I don't walk out on the street and do this. If you can access the positive intent that may be right next to the defiance and access it in some way, the Patrick lectures teach that positive intent is always stronger than our negativity. That may not be true in other realms of existence, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about being human beings on this planet. And what Patrick says is by the time you advance to a stage of being a human being on the planet with a lot of autonomy, you have a very large positive intent, and you have come here to work on your negativity. So the opposition of positive intent and negativity, that creates the strain and tension of crisis. And if we can deal with it, as I talked about in the beginning, if we can deal with that, then we can allow movement, meaning growth, to occur. And if we don't, that tension of opposition will mean that the inner will find new life circumstances to break the deadlock. The last section was about how not understanding crisis creates the dark night of the soul. So this integrates all these elements so that we may not be aware of our defiance. And so we may have created on a particular topic such an impasse of ignorance. Now, in many other lectures, I have spent a lot more time with the concept of blind spots. So it's in my study guides and online. And the physiological blind spot is an allegory. Once again, if it's true on the earth plane, it's true in spirit. There are blind spots. But that's not the end of the story. There is a blind spot, and there's one in each eye, where the optic nerve comes in the back. But the eyes have figured this out, and the mind has figured this out. So imagine if you're in the control tower of the mind, like the movie Inside Out. If you're in the control tower of the mind, you've got two telescopes with two big spots on it. And you've got to figure out how to keep looking and keep the vision going, even though you've got two actual spots in each telescope. But the telescopes move slightly independently, even though they tend to move as a pair. They have a little wiggle room. And if you keep the eyes moving, you can pre-map what was there, and like a computer program, superimpose that when the spot covers it. When you take a very, very complex eye exam, they examine you for blind spots. There is a normal size and an enlarged size. In the blind spot test, once again, Google it online, you put something so far from your face that has an X on it, and the X at some point disappears. The eye exam is to find out what distance the X disappears. Because if the X disappears when it's very close to your face, that means your blind spot is very large. That could mean a disease of some kind. But if it disappears at the normal place, but the piece of paper must be still and you have to cover one eye so that it cannot be compensated for. My poor velvet, we're going to ignore it. So, in not understanding crisis, we create the dark night of the soul. It's an underlying choice for ignorance. You can imagine the body saying, for instance, I won't adapt. I want it the way it was. And therefore there will be a necessary eruption in order to cleanse. Thank you for listening. I hope you take a look at the study guide and read the lecture. After lecture 183, The Spiritual Meaning of Crisis. Thank you.